Hi guys, and welcome to China Perspective. My name is 𝗵𝗵𝗶H', and you may know me as a German recruiter in Asia. Today we're diving into one of the most personal yet economic significant topics shaping modern China: marriage, or rather the rapid unraveling of it. This topic is especially close to my heart because my father was an official matchmaker in Germany and back in the day helped many people get married. This was way before dating apps, and I remember Polaroid pictures were being used, but also life seemed simpler, I guess, without social media. But regarding the Chinese marriage market, you may have seen it in the headlines. Not so much because of who ties the knot, but because of the shrinking of the Chinese population overall. The question on whether China will grow old before it grows rich was first asked in 2013, if I remember correctly. Actually, exactly like in many countries, and especially in countries that reach a higher level of economic maturity, China faces the same problems, that birth rates are falling and a growing number of young Chinese are choosing to not marry. But what is behind those trends? So let's look at the big picture first. Do we have a marriage crisis? Well, no. China is and continues to be a very marriage-focused culture. While yes, people also date around a bit, the absolute large majority date with the target to get married. I do not know many adults who are not married unless they are divorced, I guess. Even the large majority of foreigners coming to China, should they choose to date somebody local, are likely to get married. This is different than in many other countries which do not care so much about an official marriage certificate. So let's start with the numbers. After a small post-COVID rebound to 6.83 million registered new marriages in 2023, the number dropped sharply to an estimated 6.1 million in 2024, the lowest in 46 years. This is actually important, and it's not just a demographic curiosity. It's a social shift with actually massive economic consequences. Because marriage in China isn't just about love. It's also about housing, children, education, insurance, and intergenerational support. It's an entire ecosystem to support wealth creating and family on both sides. And yes, China is absolutely not the only country where marriage has a huge influence on the entire family. But for many in the West, we come from a different background, so I still think it's worth to speak about it. So what is driving this decrease in weddings? First, we have sky-high costs. Apartments, lavish weddings, betrothal gifts. Getting married is rarely cheap, but in China the price is extremely high, especially for men who need to show that they own an apartment and a car if they even want to have a chance at getting a wife. And then we have work pressure. China's notorious 996 culture leaves very little time for relationships. And while historically Chinese have often worked long hours, often in different cities, this is now becoming a problem for meeting the one. And like the rest of the world, also here we have gender tensions. Urban women are highly educated, financially independent, and unwilling to settle anymore. Many of them will inherit significant wealth from their parents in the form of 1 or 2 apartments. We often joke that most people on the streets of the larger cities like Shanghai or Shenzhen and so on are US dollar millionaires, or would be at least if they would sell 1 or both or more houses they inherit from their parents, even with a declining housing market. But very few would actually cash out. It's very counterintuitive to their culture. Many men, especially in rural areas, cannot meet their future wives' and parents-in-law's expectation. There's a mix of traditional expectations of men to have an apartment and a car. Then we have divorce fears. China's divorce rate peaked at 3.36 per 1,000 in 2019. A government-introduced cooling-off period has curbed that somewhat, but the damage is done. Many now view marriage as a little bit risky. Social stigma is still real, but it is really decreasing. Compare that to your great-grandparents' generation who would rather stay in an unhappy marriage because of, religion, because of what the neighbors would say, and because there was not financial security, usually for the woman. There have been some changes made to the divorce laws that are interpreted by women to traps them into unhappy marriages here recently. For example, that no alimony has to be paid mandatorily, benefiting the working parent and being a huge problem for the non-working parent. Also, family wealth is not split anymore by the couple, but belongs to the married One, such as the husband or the side of the family, such as the wife's side, who paid for the investment. This makes it extremely dangerous and unattractive to enter a traditional marriage where the wife stays at home and takes care of the kids, and it's considered risky by many women. In short, the government does want you to get married, but they don't want you to get divorced. Many of these concerns, however, do not derail lovebirds from getting married. It often just means a delay in marriage age. So to give you a reference, in the 1950s, the government actually raised the legal marriage age to 20 for women and 22 for men. The main reason for this was to delay marriage, which meant delay having babies in most cases. And today, the national average is 28.7 years for men and 26.7 years for women. Actually, around 35% of Shanghai women refuse to marry altogether because they believe their life is better alone and they do not feel lonely and they cannot find a partner who meets their requirements to be economically more successful and at the same time have a suitable personality. 30 is a magical number for Chinese women. After that, you're called 剩女 or leftover woman, a traditional but nonetheless pretty horrible way of forcing women to get married. This originates, I believe, from the belief that women expire in terms of fertility after 30 and all of that, and that was historically their main focus. There's another term for men, which is called 光棍, bare branches. So usually referring less to not wanting to get married for men, but to not being able to meet the financial requirements the family of a future wife would have, such as a car and the apartment. They are called bare branches because of their family tree, which will be barren, and they won't carry it on. So get a tree, branches, but how people view singledom will be judged heavily depending on location and socioeconomic status. If you're a woman highly educated in a large city such as Shanghai, the attitudes have shifted. In Shanghai, no one pities a single woman with a PhD and a high salary. They pity the woman who married a mediocre man just to please her parents. But if you're in a second-tier city, such as Ningbo, for example, which is a well-off city with more than 8 million people in Zhejiang province, marriage is still the norm, but it's approached with pragmatism. Families expect stability and a decent apartment, but educated women are no longer willing to rush or settle. As one put it, don't be too picky, but also don't marry a loser. Very classic Chinese parental logic. And then you have places like Xiaogang, which is a small village in Anhui province, one of the really lesser developed provinces economically. Here, marriage isn't a choice, it's a deadline. Women over 25 are seen as expired, with no real career options nearby and enormous pressure to marry early for simple economic survival. One woman put it bluntly and said, "My parents would rather I marry a complete stranger than stay single." Additionally, we have had years of selective births during the one-child policy from 1979 until 2015. The policy began as a population control measure introduced in 1979 and standardized across the country in 1980. It restricted most families to having only one child, although exceptions existed even then, especially for rural families and ethnic minorities. And yes, some pretty horrible stories are well known from those times, as this was an incredibly harsh intrusion into a family's or woman's utmost personal decision. The policy was relaxed starting in 2013, allowing some families to have 2 children, and then fully ended by early 2016 when all couples were permitted to have 2 children. And let me say this again, because I know this is not as common knowledge as one would think, and I still run into people who don't know. From 2013 onwards, some couples could have 2 kids. 3 years later, all couples were allowed to have 2 kids. Since 2021, every couple can have 3 kids. However, people don't want to. And as the families decide consciously against additional kids, the government is doing its utmost to get families to have more babies. This ranges from subsidies to the gift of a new dishwasher, a washing machine or other household items, to baby diapers or baby milk for the new family, to very well-structured and 50% reduced fertility treatments. Fertility treatments have been legal in China since around 2016 or so, including IVF and embryo freezing and so on. However, based on the written law, this is only allowed for women who are married, and single women are exempt. However, In reality, there's a fairly large market on fertility treatments also for single women, and the government turns one and a second blind eye because they really want people to have more kids. So whoever wants kids and needs help, they can get help. And now you think this might be fine, everyone just lives their life, right? But no, like in many other countries, families meddle heavily. And also in China, family pressure plays a huge role. And while I am not Chinese, throughout the 17 years I have been here, there is no other pressure a person could face that I would reasonably compare with the pressure that some Chinese parents put on their children to get married. If you're not Chinese, or if you're not at least Asian, then it is my honest opinion that you and we cannot actually understand this level of pressure. Even after having seen it firsthand with my friends as we all got older, remember I came to China already in my sophomore university year, it is indescribable. Parents start nudging daughters to marry by maybe 22, 24 years old in rural areas, and by 28 to maybe 30 years old in cities. This is also when many women will have a huge glow up during the husband search time period. For men, the pressure starts later, but it comes with expectations. Own a flat, earn a good salary, and look reasonably respectable. Sometimes we focus too much on the women and say that there's too much pressure on them. But that is not actually true. The pressure on the men is also immense. But often they are giving a bit of a choice to just marry someone from the hometown, wherever they're from, and produce a child with her, and then go back to your life in the city, so that the wife and the child can stay with the parents-in-law and live with them. But the demand for men to continue the family line is very significant too, and quite big pressure. Women who don't marry by 30 are called 𝗀𝘂, as I said, or leftover women. And that's a label that's slowly being challenged by feminist voices, but still carries a weight. Remember, feminists are the one who think that men and women should have the same rights. The problem is that it does not just affect women, it also affects the whole family. Mom and dad at home will be shamed, not only by auntie and uncle, but also by neighbors and friends. They may be asking, what's wrong with your daughter that she's not married yet? Or also, what did you, mom or dad, what did you do wrong with your daughter that she's not married yet? This is a tremendous social pressure that also the parents are experiencing from their social cycle, and many are just passing it on to their kids. It is absolutely common that parents will also forbid a marriage for whatever reason, or because they feel it's not a good match in general, or because one party does not have enough financial funds. And while I can barely imagine it, what your mom and your dad say, it's almost law. So yes, some exceptions apply, but as a general rule, if your parents don't agree, then you are not marrying that person. This is also why meeting the parents is a huge and immensely important moment. Gifts are exchanged, and I mean expensive gifts. And of course, the potential groom pays everything. There's no, let's hop by your parents' home on a random Sunday for the first time mentality. It's very formal and kind of planned out at times by the nervous young couple. Also, both families will meet each other. Here, conflicts will be tried to be solved, and if that does not work, then families can agree to spend less time if the couple really wants to get married. Meanwhile, the rural marriage market is under severe strain. With the gender imbalance due to the one-child policy back then, there are simply not enough women to have every man get married, even if they wanted to. Due to urbanization and gender imbalance, 1 out of 5 rural men may never marry. This is a huge problem and may also be linked to a higher self-harm rates amongst these men. This is most likely also why the government makes it so easy and quick to get married and so hard to get divorced. And why the shaming of women and telling them they should settle and not be so picky, basically do it for your country kind of style, is so persistent. The very last thing any government on this beautiful planet wants is a whole lot of unhappy young men who cannot find a wife. A very tricky demographic group, no matter the nationality. On an individual level, this also leads to economic choices. Families go deep into debt to pay bride prices of very easily 100,000 RMB, that's about $13,000 or more, sometimes quite a bit more. Families go into debt and even borrow from loan sharks. Some in poor rural areas like Guangxi, Anhui, Hebei and so on even turn to buy foreign brides from Vietnam or Myanmar, cheaper but often stigmatized and legally vulnerable. There are estimates of around 100,000 brides from Vietnam and several 10,000 from Myanmar, especially in the Yunnan border region, which shares a land border with the country. A Myanmar bride may cost around 50,000 renminbi, which is about $7,000 versus, for example, 200,000 RMB or $28,000 for a local bride. In fact, these foreign brides are not uncommon, and the large majority at least is willing to marry in the beginning. I've heard many stories that these bachelors use agencies or go to these countries to meet the lady and then get married. But not everything is great for the women, as they often end up in a very remote countryside where, yes, everyone has electricity, it's not that remote, but maybe not heating. And yes, she will absolutely be expected to do heavy manual housework, including cooking, cleaning, and tending, for example, for farm animals, if there's a farm, and for the elderly family members. Rural life in China, and I mean really rural, has absolutely nothing to do with Shanghai city life. Life in the countryside in China can still be very tough, and it tends to be the ones who are from the least developed regions who buy brides from cheaper countries. The families also face stigma of poverty. Neighbors may assume the groom's family is too poor to attract a Chinese bride, which is likely true, and of course there are language and cultural barriers. The husband most likely does not speak any Vietnamese or Burmese, very unlikely. The brides often struggle to assimilate and have to learn Chinese, of course, and in the beginning this can lead to gossip in rural villages. And also there are legal risks. Many marriages are not registered, leaving brides without rights and Chinese families vulnerable to fines. And then there are reasonable fraud fears of families. Some brides run away after payment. It's a common scam, actually, humiliating the groom's family and leading to loss of face and loss of money. There's a story that I heard where the husband said something along the lines of, "My parents sold half of our livestock to pay a bride price. If my wife runs away like my cousin's wife did, we are ruined." That is also why many of these brides have a clause in their contract that if they run away, their agency will replace them within a certain time frame. And before you have a heart attack, let me please remind you to not judge. While this may sound very horrible to you and the culture you are from, these are economic arrangements that both parties willingly agree to. The wife comes from a background which is often even less financially secure, so to many of them this is a welcome solution to support their family back home. Unless you yourself have repeatedly suffered hunger due to financial scarcity, I would like to invite you to reserve your outrage until you have done further research. While this is not what I want for me ever, or for you or anybody, we also have likely never been in a situation where this was one of the few ways out. And just as a side note, by the way, that arranged marriages also in Europe still existed until around the 18th century and today still does in many other countries. So you would think that given that marriages are so important that parents encourage early dating, right? Right? No. So parent logic applies. Chinese are very strongly discouraged and often even forbidden to date while still in high school or university. Of course they do a little bit, because young people are young people everywhere, but it's very different to what you may remember from your own school. But then once they graduate at the age of 22 or so years old, they are pushed into dating and basically pestered. Why don't you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? And why are you not ready to get married yet? And I know this is actually the same in various other cultures as well. So, but if everything goes well and once two people have found each other and the respective families agree, this is when things get pricey. And what does a typical wedding cost? Well, they are expensive. Here's the ballpark estimate for an urban middle-class couple. First, you have the bride price, which is somewhere between 10 to 200,000 renminbi, also called caili in China. It varies widely, so that is between $1.5 to $28,000. And that is often representing a significant financial burden. It is mandatory in many regions, but higher in wealthy provinces such as Zhejiang province or Jiangsu province. While it remains an important cultural custom, there's a growing trend towards moderation, shared financial responsibility between families, and government efforts to cap or reduce excessive bride prices. These changes aim to alleviate social pressure and economic strain on young couples amid evolving attitudes towards marriage expenses. And then there is the apartment down payment cost, easily between $500,000 and 2 million RMB, so that's 96,000 US and $278,000 US. And of course, the wedding banquet, somewhere between 3,000 to 10,000 per table. So it's somewhere between $400 and $1,300 per table. I would say most weddings have at the very least 10 tables. Actually, that number feels a little bit low to me right now based on the Chinese weddings I've been to, but you know, it may vary with the couple. And then of course you have photos, dress, planning and so on, between 10,000 to 100,000 RMB roughly. That's between 1,314K US dollar. And of course the honeymoon. Honeymoon ranges between 20 to 100,000 RMB. That's between 2,800, maybe also 14,000 US. These actually become a lot more common nowadays since the early 2000s or so, influenced by Western media, and can be quite lavish. So these numbers are for a smallish wedding. The more people you invite, the more expensive it gets, of course. But that is not all. As I already mentioned, the couple needs to have an apartment. It is usually the groom's family who has to put down the down payment for one apartment, which can be up to somewhere around 30% of the purchasing price. This is why many of my Chinese friends have at least 2 apartments from their parents, and each time they give birth to a baby boy, they buy another house, another apartment. This way the parents have time to pay it off while the son is growing up, and the son can already own the apartment and does not need to buy a new one, making him automatically eligible for marriage later on. Some couples are now opting for so-called naked marriages. No ceremony, no house, no gifts, just a legal document. Others rent wedding dresses or split costs with the bride's family. But the emotional and financial strain remains real. A typical wedding looks a little bit like this. So first comes the matchmaking and engagement, where the groom's family visits with gifts, fruit, jewelry, cash, and negotiates the betrothal gifts like gold or even property. From the groom's family, it is actually common to give the so-called 3-gold sanjin, necklace, bracelet and earrings, symbolizing wealth and stability. Chinese gold is very yellow kind of gold, and many Chinese own real gold, so percentage-wise certainly many times higher than, for example, in Europe. And then it's time for pre-wedding photos, often in over-the-top locations, think like a fake Paris backdrop or cherry blossom fantasy shots. For sure a big Western white wedding dress, but also a traditional beautiful red Chinese wedding dress. And of course, pre-wedding banquets, one for each side of the family. The wedding day itself varies by region. In the city, it's usually like a one-night banquet with a professional host, games and a show. But in rural places, it's a full 2-day food marathon. One day in the bride's village, the next day in the groom's village. Same guest, different dishes. The big day's food is fancier, but both days involve a lot of eating, toasting and noise. I've personally been invited to various weddings, and I can tell you that no one can eat all the food, and they pick the most expensive food. It's basically a sign of wealth and good fortune for the future couple. And there's a lot of drinking involved as well. If you are a guest, you are also expected to bring something, and that something tends to be money. It is put in a red color envelope called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Nowadays, you can also do it digitally. The average amount varies a little bit depending on how close you are to the couple, but at least I would say 800 RMB or so for a friend and 10 to 100K for close family members. Numbers in China are important and they are lucky numbers. So we would see a lot of 6s and 8s like 888 or 6,868. And what is also to note again is that the government really wants you to get married and have babies, like a lot of babies. The regulations to get married are being made more and more easy and less hassling. But I personally don't have the impression that this makes a big dent. Neither for matchmaking festivals, longer honeymoon vacation days, even up to 30 days in some places, or reduced payments for a first home. While well-meaning, these incentives don't address the deeper issues: financial insecurities, gender roles, and individualism. But of course, as everything is a beginning, many things also have an end. So let's have a quick look at divorce. It's not just fewer marriages, it's also more divorces. Divorce in China has gone through 3 clear phases. In the early 2000s, rates rose fast, about 8% annually, as urbanization and changing values kicked in. By 2010, the divorce rate has reached 2%, and by 2019 peaked at 3.36%, with over 4.7 million couples filing that year. The key drivers: you have more financially independent women, you have the housing market loophole, so yes, people divorce to buy a second home, and a sharp drop in social stigmata. And then came 2021 and the government's attempt to cool things down, literally, with the mandatory 30-day waiting period I mentioned. That brought filings down to around 2%, but it didn't last. By 2023, the rate had already rebounded to 2.5% or nearly 2.84 million divorces. The message is clear. Policy may slow people down, but it doesn't change how they feel. For many younger Chinese, divorce now is just a realistic option. One more reason to not rush into marriage in the first place. Remarrying after divorce is far less common in China today than it is, for example, in the US. Only about 30 to 40% of divorced people remarry within 5 years, compared to more than 60% in the US. The gap is especially stark for women, particularly in the big cities. Only 25 to 35% remarry or express that they want to remarry, while men, especially in rural areas, have a much higher remarriage rate of nearing 50% by the age of 50. Younger divorcees under 35 are far more likely to marry again, while single parents and lower-income individuals, especially mothers, face tougher odds. Wealthier men tend to remarry fastest. On average, men remarry between 38 to 45, often with a younger partner. Women remarry slightly younger, around 35 to 42, especially in cities where expectations around age gaps are more flexible. In response, new models are emerging. So we have DINGs, dual income, no kids. We also see contract marriages, especially among the LGBTQ community. So basically what happens is that homosexuality is more accepted amongst the younger generation in China, but far less so amongst their parents or grandparents. To avoid family pressure, some gay male or women agree to a parent-arranged heterosexual marriage. After having a child to fulfill family expectations, they may then separate, sometimes with or without the other partner's knowledge. The situation is also called as 𝗵𝗵𝗶 or a cheated marriage, where the spouse often discovers only later that their partner is homosexual. Legally, these marriages remain valid since sexual orientation is not a ground for annulment under Chinese law, so divorce is an option if both parties agree. And then we also have sleep divorces, so legally separated couples who still live together. This is often done for legal homeowner reasons. But we see, marriage is no longer a one-size-fits-all. And finally, let's put China into a global context. China is part of a broader East Asian trend, but its demographic rate and speed of change makes the economic implications more urgent. So here's the big takeaway. China's marriage trends aren't just cultural. Some of them are economic, some of them are strategic, and they shape how people work, what they buy, where they live, and what kind of futures they're planning for, if any. So if you want to understand China's future workforce, its consumer base or its social stability, it would be good to understand what's happening in the marriage market. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this topic and maybe you learned a little bit about how things are done in a different country. Thank you so much for watching, and if you found this insightful, don't forget to like and subscribe or share. Thanks for tuning into my channel, and if you have a business or HR related question, you can find my email in the description. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye bye.